to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation, and we're here to discuss key publications, articles, and book reviews from our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today is our retrospective month, and we're delighted to be discussing an article that was published in the June 2021 issue. That article is titled, How Might God Have Guided Evolution? Scientific and Theological Viewpoints. It was written by Peter Bussey, and we're delighted to have Peter with us today. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And Peter is over in the United Kingdom. So there may be some in this audience who haven't met you before, Peter. So let's just take a few minutes to introduce you. Just where in the UK are you now?
Well, I live in the city of Norwich, which is in the east of England, sort of northeast of London, 120 miles or so from the capital. It's a city of about, 120,000, 150,000 people, so medium size.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
It's got universities and so on.
Yeah. Is that where you were born and raised?
No, I would call myself a sort of East Londoner, really. Mm-hmm. But our family moved to Norwich when I was 12, and I finished my schooling there. Mm-hmm. Then I went to Cambridge for university and PhD.
And what was your field? What was your field there, Peter?
Natural sciences, specializing in theoretical physics.
Ah, okay.
But I eventually became an experimental physicist.
Roll of toilet paper in the hall bathroom, because I know they spend time in the chats and they enjoy it, and they might need to use the bathroom, right?
I don't know where that's coming from. Someone's out there needs to be muted. Ricky, did that get everyone muted? All right, Peter, let's get back.
Where was I? I spent most of my academic career in Glasgow, where I taught students and did research in elementary particle physics, which I still continue to do at a lower level from home in retirement from teaching.
Okay.
But I've always had a strong interest in science and faith matters.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up in a Christian home, or how did you come to faith?
Oh, yes, I grew up in a Christian home, but I did have to come to my own decision in my teens to keep going with this.
Okay. And how did you get interested in physics? How did you choose physics in this sense?
Well, I suppose ever since I was fairly small, I was just interested in sort of basic science.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So, tell us again here that in terms of how did you in your career, what was the key topic that you focused on?
Well, elementary particle physicists join collaborations, and every so often, one particular experiment gets finished, and you join another one. These experiments take years to do, typically.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And right now, I'm a member of the so-called Atlas collaboration at the CERN laboratory in Geneva. Mm-hmm. That's going to keep going for an indefinite period, probably longer than I wish to stay around with it, but that's to be seen.
Yeah, right. Now you've published a few things on science and faith, I believe, right? You've got a book or two out. You remind us what that is?
Yes, I have a book published by IVP USA. It's called Signposts to God, and it argues that modern physics and astronomy are perfectly positive towards religious faith. So Signposts to God. If you haven't got it, that's the title.
That's it. Okay, that's great. So how did you come to write this article? What caught your interest, and how did you come to do this one?
Well, I'd written quite a few articles on various aspects of this for the journal Science and Christian Belief over the years. And the time seemed to have come to try and put it all together into one volume.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this article we're discussing today, how might God have guided evolution? Why should we bother talking about this? What's important about thinking about God guided evolution? What does it mean, and why?
Well, I don't need to remind anybody who's tuned in today about the, controversial nature of the subject of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that we really need to try to understand it from a variety of angles. Is it that God set everything up and just let it all happen? Or did God intervene? There's a lot of argument about this, and I don't really want to get into any details. That wasn't my purpose. I read this rather good article by Jim Stump in one of the earlier issues of the journal, and it seemed to me that while I agreed with most of what he said, I didn't quite agree with the conclusions that you can keep science and the theology separate. I believe that you can certainly try to fold them together and that it's helpful. And so this was why I wrote the article that we're talking about, for me, this evening, today.
Okay, well, that's fair, and I'm pleased to see that Jim Stump has joined us, and look forward to perhaps hearing from him later. But help me a little bit. Is this just a discussion about history, about what happened in the past and how God did things in the past, or does it have any relevance for us in the future other than head knowledge?
It's a good question. Do we really care? Well,
Right.
If you've got a world in which human beings are here for a purpose, for a divine purpose, then I think it's quite interesting to think about how this purpose was historically achieved.
Mm-hmm.
Did God just set it all up and let it run? Or has there been a need for God to sort of intervene from time to time? Now, I don't actually know the answer. And my article just suggests how God might have intervened in a way which isn't too disturbing for the conventional scientific picture. But as I say, I don't know the answer to this. It's something that one could think about and try to formulate deeper thoughts on, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. That's fair enough. And so I think, Vicky, if you've opened up the microphones, I think we can move on to a discussion. We've had a number of questions submitted in advance, and we will start with those. And then after that, I will call on those of you who've clicked the raise hand button under the reactions, and then we'll proceed with the discussion in that way. So the first question was submitted by Del Kuhn, and I see him on over here. So Del, good to see you back again. And if you could unmute yourself and ask Peter your question.
Hey, Randy, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you for calling
There
on
you
me.
are.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your article. My quantum mechanics comes via chemistry, so I think you're a couple levels below me or deeper than me as far as what's really going down under there. But whenever I hear either chemistry or physical processes applied to mental processes, I'm reminded of Nietzsche's comment on Descartes that the real question is whether I is the subject or the object of the verb think. So what I wonder is whether God created the stuff underneath us with something like the uncertainties in quantum mechanics in order to bring about us as agents who can make true, real choices in the world. And as far as evolution goes, I'm willing to extend that sort of agency down to animals working on, choosing at the species appropriate level that's analogous to free choice, our free choice. So my question is really, any thoughts on this? And what would you suggest looking into to try to at least clarify my own thoughts on it?
Well, that's a pretty deep question indeed. Let me say first, I'm a physicist, and I don't believe that the conscious mind can be dealt with in terms of physics. There are those who disagree, but that's my viewpoint. There's something new going on, and that means that we have to think sort of laterally and in various other directions. But even so, once you've got the mental under your consideration, there's something much more general called the spiritual. And they're not quite the same. You can be very mental and not at all spiritual. And I take spirituality to be to do with the relationships, to do with interhuman relationships and our relationship with God. So how much this has got to do with quantum mechanics, I'm really not sure about at all. I suspect not very much. I think we're talking about something new which science hasn't dared try to deal with right now. I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
Fair enough. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't have asked.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's something we can all ponder on. So I think that's good. So thank you, Del. I'd like to move on to Daryl Falk. Daryl, welcome to the program here.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Sarah Lane Ritchie was a guest on this Diving Deeper discussions several months ago. And her proposal on the uniqueness of the mind as an intense locus for divine action is similar to that which you discussed in the paper. And I like the work very much. However, the nature of consciousness is one of the great mysteries in the universe. There's a lot of proposals out there as it relates to that, so I'm not sure if I quite would agree with what you say with respect to the clear. I mean, you're giving your own position, but there's a lot of people, of course, who maybe the majority think that there's a physical basis to it. But anyways, however, the nature of consciousness is one of the great mysteries in the universe, and by putting a special but all important emphasis on the divine activity on the mind, are we not playing into the God of the gaps scenario? And how can this be avoided? If it's true, how can it be avoided? And should it be avoided?
Okay. Well, the God of the gaps comes in when you have a whole lot of phenomena which you think that science ought to be able to describe, and you don't know how to deal with this particular phenomenon. And so you say, well, God did that specially. And then people fill in a bit more science, and they say, well, whatever you think about the laws of nature and God, that particular set of activities wasn't special after all. You thought it was special, but it isn't really. It's just another example of laws of nature. But I don't think you can say that God must never interact in the universe, because that would be God of the gaps. Surely we allow God to act from time to time or in various ways. And so one would need to have a rationale for this. Now, think about the miracles of Jesus. Jesus, let's say, heals a blind man. Now, are we going to say, well, we don't understand how he did it, but there must have been a scientific explanation? The fact that Jesus says this was the power of God was simply a God of the gaps thing. No, I don't think so. If you're confident that you understand science and it's not just a gap in the science, then if something happens which is outside our confident understanding of science, then you certainly have the right to ask, well, what's causing it? You may very well want to extend the science, but if you're confident enough, as with the miracles of Jesus, then you'll have to consider that perhaps there's an additional power coming into play.
Well, Peter,
I can see that with respect to miracles of Jesus. I just don't see it with respect to the status of studies on consciousness. That's in that same basis. There's a lot of work going on with respect to the physical basis of consciousness, and it does kind of seem to me. I'm not sure it's wrong to do so, but it does seem to me that that the proposal is jumping in and saying, so we're going to put God into this position. It's very much an active area of research, and may well have a physical basis with nothing particularly new emerging as the studies continue.
Well, as I said, I cannot see how something so different from physics as consciousness can be physical. It's something else. But as far as I can tell, it's not physical. But I never said that any kind of act of consciousness is a divine miracle. I never said that. If you want to have laws of consciousness, I'm not particularly arguing about that. So I'm not sure where the God of the Gaps suggestion really comes from, because I didn't say that the existence of consciousness was a sort of divine miracle, although it might be. I simply said it's not physics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peter, may I ask you a little bit to follow on Daryl's question here, and you responded with a focus on the miracles of Jesus, and I know there's a tendency for a lot of people to kind of connect the two, but if you think of this from a scientific perspective, isn't it intellectually honest only to say science doesn't know? Because it's not reproducible. It's not something you can study in terms of a cause and effect. And from a scientific angle, maybe the best answer is I don't know.
Yes, I wouldn't borrow that.
Because we really have to back off and say, this is out of this realm. We don't understand it from a scientific point of view. Whereas from a faith point of view, it makes eminent sense.
Yes, I wouldn't quarrel with that at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think consciousness is the same factor. At this point, I think we all have to agree. Science has no answer at the moment. No one has solved the problem of consciousness. You've articulated in your book that you do not see how physics leads to consciousness, and I agree. I don't think anyone sees it. And it's a very different conclusion to say, and I don't know that you actually have, that therefore there is a divine agent that caused consciousness to begin with. But I think it is fair that we can say we're still open to future investigation.
Well, let's bear in mind that we presumably believe that God created everything.
Yes.
And not just physics and the laws of physics, consciousness too, and all of that area, whatever it may be. So we're going to say that God is still the creator of it all, aren't we?
Yes. That's our common assumption here among at least those, almost all of those who are here, at least. So yeah, that is our common assumption. So okay, let's move on to the next. There were a total of 4, I think. The next one is Cy Gart. Hello, Cy.
Hello.
You asked your question?
Yeah. I was very intrigued by your the last part of your paper where you talked about the possibility of God intervening by communication with minds. And I think you did say with animal minds, including humans. And so my question is, I think we could all agree that all minds are not equivalent when it comes to the capability of receiving communications and acting on them. I'm thinking of different animals. And I'm wondering whether it would be interesting to look. I looked at this in kind of a general way, but in more detail about how effective God's communication would be to various kinds of animal minds. For example, humans, and versus dogs versus mice or whatever, all of which have minds, brains at least. And one indication of how effective that might be, and this is sort of my question, could be the relative acceleration of evolution of those animals from ancestors. And I kind of looked at that with humans, and I would love to be corrected by anyone who knows more about this than I do, which is not very much. But humans, evolved very quickly. When you start with the great apes and you end up with us, there's a continual acceleration of evolution as we get to our level. And that acceleration occurs a little bit the same in dogs and cats, but much slower, and quite a bit slower in rodents. And again, this is all very rough. I don't have any details, but do you think that would count as evidence for your idea? Does that have anything to do with the possibility that God is communicating to minds, but the human minds are the ones that are most attuned or most able to deal with it?
Yes, that's right. That's precisely the sort of thing I was trying to say. I think we're very much on the same wavelength here.
Okay, thank you.
So well, help me understand a little bit more. Exactly what is the connection between God communicating with our consciousness or our mental abilities and the genetic level evolution? Where's the connection?
Well, you're really asking a very deep question. We don't understand how mentality really fits in with the physical brain, but we know that the physical brain, I suppose we know that the physical brain has to have a certain degree of development for this to be possible. Now, there are philosophers these days who call themselves panpsychists. They think that mind is everywhere and it just gets into, I suppose, some brains more easily than others. So that's one set of thinking, which, I don't know how respectful these philosophers are, but they publish books which seem to be sort of respectable philosophy. But now we're saying, well, given all that, how can God interact? You might say, well, how does God interact with me, assuming that he can? I mean, I certainly sense sometimes that I'm being guided in one way or another, and it's a purely subjective feeling, but it seems to be valid because if I do what I feel I'm guided to do, it seems to work. So I suppose that whatever sort of way God has to sort of give us impulses could apply to suitably developed animals too. It's just a hypothesis. I don't know how you quite evaluate this experimentally, but I just take it by analogy.
Yeah, if I may throw in a few questions here in terms of some possibilities. I don't know how this applies to non-human species, but from a human point of view, where we feel we have spiritual communication with God and to commune with God is a key part of our faith. I understand that. So is it fair to speculate that the path from God's communication with us to a modification of our genome is along several possible paths? Perhaps it is, as we follow his commandments, those activities lead to changes in either the epigenome or the genome in terms of the behavior and get locked in some way. Or else, as we follow God's commands, it modifies our behavior in terms of sexual selection, in terms of the type of people we associate with, which in turns, shapes selective breeding. I don't know. There are probably many different ways of doing that, but I could speculate. I don't know if any of these apply to non-human species, however.
Well, yes, exactly. I'd certainly put all of that on the table. Mm-hmm. I think C.S. Lewis, in one of his fiction books, said that he put into the mouths of some angels in his book that they really wanted a particular pair of proto-humans to come together because the outcome would be important. Now, this is C.S. Lewis writing a bit of science fiction, mm-hmm. but right. It's not so impossible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. All right. We have one more question submitted in advance, and that's by Merrill Edmonds, who I believe this is your first time here. So welcome to the program, Merrill. And if you could unmute yourself, what you just did, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm a retired endocrinologist, so I feel out of my depth in all of this, but I did have a question. I enjoyed the article, and I had a question. I hope it's not too irrelevant. In Matthew 22:37, Jesus indicated, I think, the divine purpose of creation, in that humans were to love the Lord your God. Free will, I think, would appear to be essential for true agape love. If God was actively and directly involved in maintaining his creation, man could not be free. God would know exactly how to manipulate any of us into doing what he wanted. And since God is love, he would have no choice but to do things that would cause us to love him. But we would love him because we ate the loaves and had our fill, as Jesus said of the throngs following him in John 6:26. Did God really have any other choice but to create a world that functions without his involvement? If not, what better way to do this than to endow an initial explosion of matter and energy with enough intrinsic robustness that life spontaneously developed on one of a trillions of planets over many millions of years, resulted in a creature capable of incorporating God's image and with whom he could have an agape relationship. This, of course, doesn't exclude God intervening in his creation. And making man in his image is one example. But these acts of God must be rare in order for the world to avoid descending into chaos, as Francis Collins has stated, and for us to truly have freedom. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think I'm going to argue with anything in particular that you've said, but you've raised a lot of different points here. You've raised the question of the actual creation or appearance of life on this planet. Now, that's a very interesting question, and there's been a lot of debate in this journal as to what's going on here. You've said that all you really need is for life to appear spontaneously in one of however many trillions of planets could be. If that were the case, if it was so unlikely, I think we would be unlikely to know for sure if this has happened or not. We would be unlikely to be able to calculate the probability. And we might say, well, it's so unlikely it'll never happen. Or we might say, well, it'll happen in just one planet. Indeed, we might say all that. But there are issues here which make it very interesting to try to see if life has developed on Mars. Because if life developed on Mars, as well as Earth, where we know it happened, that would indicate that life wasn't all that rare. It was just the first planet, other than our own, that we looked at as life. And there are people who are looking for signs of life in the atmospheres of distant planets. The idea is that the planet passes in front of its star, and you can, with great delicacy, try to look at the atmosphere of these extraterrestrial planets, see if there's, for example, any oxygen. That might make you think that there's been photosynthesis. So all this is an ongoing and very interesting part of astronomy. But having said all that, all we need to do right now is keep our eyes on this. It could be that life is common. It could be that we just don't understand how on earth this complicated phenomenon could occur spontaneously. So there are a lot of open questions there, but I'm not going to argue with your suggestion that all you really needed was an unusual event on one planet in the universe. Now, where have I got up to? Would you raise your next point, please?
Sorry?
Well, I answered at one point which Merrill raised, but there are a lot of other things too, and I've forgotten where I've got up.
Well, maybe we can come back to them later in the interest of letting more people combine. If you don't mind, Merrill, feel free to come back and ask the other aspects later. We've got several people with raised hands right now, and anyone else who wants to speak or ask a question, click on reactions and raise your hand. Next is Steve. Good to have you back again. Could you unmute yourself, ask your question, please? Thank you.
Thank you. This may be.
No, you're muted. You accidentally muted yourself.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. My interest is the cross of language to science, which is really a way of saying faith to science. The Jewish people consider the three events of Bara very interestingly, much like in your summary quote, you say, creation took place in three stages: physical with the Big Bang, mental, and spiritual, unquote. The Jewish people look at it the same way many times, the majority do, that the first Bara brought material, the second Bara brought mental, the second Bara being in day 5, where the Nefesh creatures were made. And focusing on the third Bara, many different opinions come about the spiritual. Can you hazard an opinion how the spiritual makes contact with humanity, and I guess really for all three, when? And relate that to Genesis 1 if possible.
Well, I'm very interested in what you say about the Jewish tradition, which I'm really rather ignorant about. If you could possibly email me with a good reference to this way of thinking in the Jewish tradition, I'd be very grateful, because that sounds as if we're on the same wavelength here. But the spiritual, well, it's very difficult to define. In terms of what would you like to define the spiritual? I think all you can do is to ask, what is it that makes us personal, as opposed to just minds with thoughts, and associate that with our spiritual nature. Things like values, as I say, relationships, something connecting us with God in a relational way, a cluster of things here. But it's rather difficult to define spirituality, because I don't know what you would have that's more basic. It's just something that we kind of recognize in ourselves, in our better moments, and in others, when we see people who seem to just be, well, spiritual. That's not a very good answer, but I think it's hard to intellectualize about this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think it's an area of exploration and discussion. No simple answers, right? Okay, thank you, Steve. Jim, it's a delight to have you with us. Your name has not been taken in vain here. In fact, it's the basis for our being here. So let's hear from you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Randy, for alerting me to the fact that this was happening, and I'm happy to join you. And thanks, Peter, for thinking what I had written had enough merit to at least deserve some further comment. And I think I've just given your article a read through this morning, and I think there's a lot of overlap with what the two of us are trying to do here. Let me make just a couple comments, and I'd be happy to get your reaction to it. The first comment, I guess, is just an interesting observation that you critiqued me a bit for not really giving a clear answer to the question I posed, did God guide our evolution? And then the very conclusion of your article was, I'm unable to propose a clear answer to Jim Stump's original question. So I think that's part of the problem that we're trying to grapple with a little bit, is why we can't give a perfectly clear answer.
That one was a boomerang, wasn't it, Peter? Yeah.
So this the proposal you're making then of God guiding evolution through the mental state, I think is perfectly plausible and legitimate to consider. A couple of questions, I guess, I have about that. One, I think it fits into the framework of what I was trying to do pretty easily by saying this is an example of the personal discourse. This is now a personal agent communicating with another personal agent. And I don't see that as a scientific description of how God guided evolution as much as it is an unpacking of the personal discourse in which I said, God intentionally created human beings in his image. So I don't have much to quarrel at that level of it. What I guess I'd push for, though, is to say that God communicates with human beings at that level doesn't explain very much of how human beings evolved. So the most of the work of your explanation is going to have to be how God is able to do this with creatures before human beings to get to the point where human beings evolved, right? So how far down the evolutionary scale you can go where that kind of interaction is efficacious in the Randy brought up a couple of the possibilities. The selection process is the one I guess I found most plausible there. How far down can God nudge one individual to mate with another individual through this mental communication with them is something we'd have to sort out, because many of as I understand, our mental capabilities, the components of these are rooted deeply in our evolutionary past, that these have to be there in order for us to have the kind of mental capacities that we do. But perhaps that's where you would disagree anyway. So I guess I'm just asking for more of an account of the communication with pre-human beings is what's really necessary to give your account of how humans evolved in order to give that full account.
Okay, well, it's really by analogy. And of course, I don't know how this is going to work, because in principle, God can do anything he wants. The question would be, how actually might this have happened? Which is, of course, a very open question. You can't say God could not have communicated and have had an effect of the behavior of what we say earthworms. The question is, what was the actual chosen method? And we haven't been told that. So, yes, you've raised a lot of good questions, which I don't think we're in a position to answer. They're just possibilities. it could be that by the time you get to fish, God is able to put a bit more oomph into the evolution of fish. But I did say in the article that in principle, if we knew enough about chemistry and physics and all of that, we might be able to calculate the probabilities of fish developing into amphibians and so on. I'm sure we don't have that knowledge in any way. But in theory, ideally, we would know all of this, and we could say, well, the knowledge that we have isn't enough to enable us to explain the rapid rate of evolution in certain contexts. And then you would have a kind of scientific indicator as to some other factor. But you'd really have to understand the science well. Otherwise, you are just saying, well, it's a God of the gaps thing. So you really have to understand the science. I don't think we do. So I think these are all very open questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with all this emphasis on the mental and the communication, I'm a little bit concerned here because I do believe correctly that all of you are kind of seeing this as an augmentation or an enhancement or some kind of an additional way. But still, the vast majority, there are billions of years of pre-mental kind of evolution. And in order to get to a reasonable place where there are mental capabilities, there's an awful lot of evolution here. What about God's guidance during that period? Is it absent or through a different mechanism, or neither mentality nor consciousness are there?
Well, as I said in the article, I suppose that for most of the history of the evolutionary process, it occurred just as Darwin and his followers said.
Without guidance?
Well, good question. But if I were a skeptic, I would simply say, yeah, without guidance. I don't know whether there was any guidance or not. But the supposition of all sort of mainstream evolutionists says that at this stage, there didn't need to be any. It just happened.
Well, let me just throw this out. We don't have to discuss it and we can move it later. But I suggest that in all of this, we may need a different view of guidance. In my opinion, guidance is probably too soft or too mild a term, but God is completely the creator and sustainer of everything that happened, and his will is carried out through the evolutionary process. So guidance, in one sense, he controls that entire process. What we don't know, and in this sense, I kind of agree with Jim's original article here, that there is a cognitive dissonance in terms of that may be a connection that we can never understand. How is it that the chance processes we see in nature are identical with God carrying out his will? I don't know, but it seems to me that instead of saying that God isn't guiding during that time, that there's a deeper level of guidance which is always there. So yeah, I say I don't know, but those are just some thoughts to think about. Okay, who's next? Carol Hill, good to see you back.
Hi, Randy. Hi, everybody. I just kind of came in a little bit late. Thanks for putting my first name in. I guess the title is that the article or the book, God Guided Evolution? Because I haven't got my December PSCF yet. So is that a book, Peter?
No, Carol, this is the June issue. It came right after the articles that we talked about last month.
June. Okay.
You stopped reading after your article.
I don't see, I'm going to comment more on what Jim says because that makes sense to me. I don't think it has anything to do with the nature of consciousness. I think it has everything to do with biochemistry, because you start at the lowest animals and they're able to adapt to their environments. For example, in the Cosmura labotubes in Hawaii, there are these completely regressed plant hopper species that have done so in 500 years. And how we know that is we can date the lava flows. You only have 500 years, and you've had in different labotubes, you actually have different subspecies of regressive evolution. So somehow animals from the COVID on, which we've now got, 3 reiterations, Omicron or something, they are able to adapt to their environment. So somehow down in the biochemistry, God can, I don't say he's physically determining evolution, but I think that is the biggest contributor to evolution. And then when you get to higher forms, you have a more and more different adaptations to the environments, like the primates in Madagascar up to us. Now that's where consciousness comes in, because I think our minds, it has evolved, I think, with God's direction up to our consciousness. So it appears like it's in our consciousness, but really God has been sustaining, has set up the proteins or whatever, the biochemistry, where you get to our consciousness. And that, in my view, would be on purpose, so that there's a species that he can interact with. I don't know if that makes sense. Cy probably knows more than I do about that. He knows all about biochemistry. But that seems the most logical thing, because you've got to explain the lower animals too, and how they are adapting so quickly to their environment. So God, I would say God guided evolution through the biochemistry, if you want to try to put it simply. And so anyway.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Peter, your comments.
Yes, I wouldn't want to undervalue biochemistry. I think biochemistry is amazing. But maybe I should just bring up again William James, the philosopher, who pointed out that if consciousness, the conscious mind, didn't do anything in the evolutionary context, why should it be there at all? So I'm supporting William James strongly and saying that whatever it is that the mind does, if it didn't do anything, we wouldn't have it, at least not from the evolutionary point of view. So it's going to be biochemistry plus more besides.
Yeah, but if God is guiding biochemistry, he's guiding it in a process that will end up as consciousness, and then that consciousness, that evolved evolution up to consciousness, allows him to deal with us, interact with us. That's the idea.
We need to talk about what you mean by God guiding the biochemistry.
Well, that's where I'm not a biochemist, and I don't know. All I know is that at least my grandson, he's taking genetics at Colorado State. He says that the proteins, actually, there are ways that they can switch on and off to help the organism adapt to the environment. So maybe it's on and off proteins, and that's the limit of my knowledge of genetics. But like I say, Cy would know that.
Yeah.
Well, that is a really fascinating subject. It's way beyond my expertise.
Well, may I just suggest that I don't think there's a biochemical answer to that question. But here's where I, just to tip my hand personally, is that I lean a little bit more to what Jim Stump is saying in terms of cognitive dissonance, because I think that we need a coherent. We're not suggesting, Peter, that consciousness is not involved, but I think we have to have a comprehensive view of God's guidance in all things, not just in certain areas. And God's guidance is everywhere. And I don't think we will ever understand that from biochemistry or from any types of things. And I do believe that commitment to God's guidance is one we get by faith through revelation. And I think there is a level of cognitive dissonance there that makes us uncomfortable, and we don't like the dissonance. But I agree with what you wrote, Peter, that it's inclusive here, that I do think we can see both at the same time without understanding exactly how that interaction works. And I'm sorry to get my soapbox here, but I think this is vital for how we view every day. I don't think this is really just linked to evolution, but I think how we see God in our lives is critical, that we stop seeing God only in those things we don't understand or in the gaps, and as soon as we understand the biochemistry, then we can forget God. Somehow we need to return to that. No, you aren't, Carol. I didn't mean to.
God is guiding it. God is guiding the.
You said the same thing. I agree with you.
The biochemistry.
Right.
Well, are you saying that all the various processes, what we would call physical and biological processes, are occurring in a particular way that they would not occur in if God wasn't doing something?
Well, I don't know if I'm saying that, but yes, kind of. I think God controls all things. And Merrill, where was he now, was kind of saying that at the beginning in the Big Bang, things came together. He was controlling that to get to life and biochemistry and coming up to us. Now, whether there's other sentient human beings elsewhere, that, of course, we don't know, but I don't see why there couldn't be.
Well,
I mean, from the same process.
Well, are you saying that we got laws of nature that we discovered by doing experiments in the laboratory, and they seem to be pretty universal? But in actual practice, the universe has, either continuously or occasionally just departed from these laws of nature because God is massaging everything.
Well, God is universal in nature, and he is, that's my idea of guiding nature. He's in nature, guiding it to his ends.
So, and I would just say that every law of nature exists under God's guidance. And we need a more comprehensive view of what God's guidance means. And I don't know how to articulate it.
Well, that goes to evolution as well as any of the physics or anything. But
okay, we should.
Biochemistry is in the end physics. So.
All right, we should move on and give a few other people a chance. Thank you very much, Carol. Appreciate that. Bill Grady, how are you? Okay. If you could unmute yourself, and we need to get you off mute. Okay? Let's see. You're still muted, Bill. Can you? You're having trouble unmuting it. I can't unmute you. There you go. Okay.
I got it. Yeah, my hand started shaking. This is the first time I've been on here. So,
yes, well, appreciate your being here. Okay, go ahead.
You. And the thing that I'm observing, I think, with Carol's conversation is that I see academically and scientifically, we all sit in our specialties, and nobody has all of the answers in their lap. But what we're trying to do is connect them all together, I think. And that's kind of what I've been struggling with, is connecting the dots. I have a statement that I heard some months ago that's really been on my mind. And this is a good think tank to put it into. I wish I had written down the guy's name when I got it, but it's going to come under the heading of anonymous. But anyhow, the way it was offered, it was in light of the explaining free will. Okay? Now, the statement was that God acts anonymously with us so that we can live autonomously with him. And I think of Isaiah in the throne room where he says, "Woe is me, I'm undone." And if God shows his hand up front, it's such an intimidating experience that we would have no choice but to follow him along. Now, with that said, in light of the question here, how might God have guided evolution, scientific, theological viewpoints? I was working on a Quora post this afternoon that pointed me back to Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And he has a picture of the chimp chromosome and the human chromosome side by side. And the difference is identified at the second chromosome, where the chimp has two pieces and the human has what appears to be a fusion of the two pieces head to head. My note in the book, when I read it several years ago, said, is this a genetic upgrade, or is it an afternoon in God's laboratory? So the thing that I'm feeling around for and would like to get your feedback on is that I am pretty confident that the anonymous part of how God works is basically off of our map and off of our agenda, in the context that I think he works at the molecular level. So we don't see it, but quantum physics starts to explain it. The backside of that is that the autonomy that we have gives us the choice, and that goes into the conversation today, where you get your guidance either at the mental and spiritual level. And of course, Christ says you got to be born again, so that's where the spiritual level gets introduced. And the molecular level works perfectly well, clear back from where Carl started with the Big Bang, because I personally believe that God delivered the initial singularity. That's our best scientific explanation for how it all began. If you don't go to God, then you can go off to black holes and things like that.
So your question,
let's
move on
a little bit. My question is, how do you feel about the idea that God gives his guidance anonymously, so that we're not interpreted and
I'm not sure what you mean by anonymously. I mean, the whole universe is an expression of the creative word of God. So right. Can you clarify that?
I clarified in the context that If he's operating at the molecular level, he's been in control of evolution from the first picosecond of time. And like the chimp example, he would be likely to be the one who defines the head-to-head fusion at the second chronotherm level. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, well, your secular scientist would say that there are laws of nature, wherever they come from. The secular scientist isn't very clear about that. And these laws of nature do have a governing power. I mean, things happen because of these, let's say, metaphysical quantities, and they do make things go along. And Christians will say, well, God created all that. And with that, you could say, well, God is acting at the molecular level because the laws of nature govern what is happening at the molecular level. If you're going to say that actually every random number is generated by God, you're shaking your head, so not saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would be something quite different. So are you really just saying that all of the laws of nature are set up so that they'll work well?
Yes.
Yes, good. Well,
yes. And when he made the kinds, he put up the limits that they operate in.
Yeah. Well, this is where I suppose most of us would tend to agree that at least up till the point of mentality, which surely has an effect, but we're not sure what it is, it's all going to be the laws of biochemistry, physics, and chemistry just chugging along with random effects, which are just built into the system, just as Darwin would have said. And with that, we're probably not going to be disagreeing with each other.
Well, if I may put in one final point here, and then we'll move on to Jesse, is that I struggle with this anonymous business. It just has the implication to me that if I think of the opposite of anonymous, what would it mean if it weren't anonymous? If God's work here, if we're not, if I understand you correctly, and I don't fully understand that. I think that every action of every law of nature and everything that happens is a not very anonymous, but a big declaration of God's guidance and God's sustaining power. I mean, God's sustaining power of all creation is as Romans 1:20 says, it's a glorious expression of divine power and His glory. It's not very anonymous. Oh, no, it's not a scientific, logical kind of thing because you can't explain it anything else, but that's the wrong signature.
No,
your secular evolutionist would say, are you really saying that God created every single parasite deliberately and a lot of nasty things which we really wish weren't there, like viruses and the lot? If you believe that God created the laws of nature and they just happen, then the bad effects are just a side effect, just the price you pay for the good effects. So I think you have to think that one through.
Yeah, I agree. You have to go back to original sin discussions. Okay, let's move on. Thank you very much, Bill. Jesse, I don't believe you've asked a question here before. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. Yeah, first question. So I guess I want to ask, is because I'm having a tough time really understanding how we're using the word guide. My one question, or I guess two-part question would be, is the question whether or not he guided evolution or how did he? And then if the question is, did he at all, would the alternative be, did he supervise it, I suppose? And then I was going to ask Peter if he finds either one more attractive than the other.
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, we do have to be clear about this. The line that I took in the paper was that there is creation. And this is a highly biblical concept. God set things up and they work. And if you then talk about guidance, of course, the laws of nature are, as it were, like the road along which evolution passes. They guide the processes in that sense, and they are from God. But I have taken the term guidance to mean that God does things which the laws of nature would not be capable of doing if they were just acting as God created them in the first place. Now, it's, how should I say, philosophically sort of questionable to say God set it all up, created everything, and now has to step in and make sure the laws do exactly what is required, when it wasn't all there by implication right from the start. I mean, these are questions to talk about, but this is, I'm really trying to sort of stick, certainly for the purposes of argument, as closely as possible to sort of standard physics, chemistry, and biochemistry. Then I say, well, how could we accept all of the physics and chemistry and biochemistry as God's creation, and have a sort of opening for an extra effect which doesn't upset all that? You may not need it. You may say, well, if God wants it done, it's going to be done. Don't need to do it to be too philosophical here. If God wants some chimpanzees, he'll just make sure that chimpanzees happen. But if you're going to say, let's stick as far as possible to the standard science, then you're going to have to say, well, are there areas where the standard science doesn't seem to be sufficient? We're not now talking about a gap. We're talking about a limit, not a gap in the science, but a limit to the science. And this is where I brought in questions of mentality. And as I say, William James at the end of the 19th century brought this one up. So this is not my invention. And I accept that what he said is a point that needs to be thought about. Now, you may or may not decide that there are laws of conscious activity and we just don't know them yet. We certainly don't. But it does, in my opinion, I say in my opinion, open a broader window for God to be active, actively active, if you say that mentality is God's natural sphere of influence, and so he may have decided to let this be the means by which important things are made to happen. So that was my point of view here. Have I sort of clarified enough, do you think?
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think, Jesse, you raise a very good point. And I would just step back and say that this is a deeper and broader issue that we need to deal with. Some of you may have read the article a few years ago I published where I stated what I considered the four key issues, or four of the key issues that ASA needs to tangle with in terms of science and faith. And the third one of those is randomness and purpose. And I think this is a deep issue. And I think this is where the issue of evolution and God's guidance really comes to play as a subset of that bigger picture. Because we clearly see from science that randomness is essential in nature. It is real. It is not simply a perception, but there is real randomness there. Now, it gets very confusing because nothing is purely random, and nothing is purely determined here. There's probabilities all over the map at every level, quantum levels, and everywhere. There are probabilities, there are chances, and they're all constrained. None of them are unconstrained. So it gets to be very, very complex. Now, if then you balance all that evidence for randomness, and you say on the other side that our faith and our revelation tells us that there is a purpose, God's purpose, that we exist through his purpose. And we say, well, if you got this sequence of chances, you can quickly calculate that the probability is zero of you getting this. Okay, well, clearly that's the wrong way to approach it. So we have to struggle with, okay, how do we blend the two? And particularly since evolution is not just evolution, quantum mechanics, everything else. I mean, everything's really has a core component of randomness here. And how do we connect that with God achieving his purpose at some level? I have no answers. I just feel that it's one of the three major unsolved challenges that all of us need to grapple with. And one thing I'm very grateful about to all of you who have written and participated here, because this is an ongoing discussion I think is vital. Okay, so anyone else have? I don't see any more raised hands. Someone else wants to? We're past our 1 hour limit, but we allow an overage till hour and a half. So I don't want to cut off anyone. Who is Terry Gray? Ah, yes. Good to have your comment. You usually say something in these, so I'm glad to have you here. Go ahead.
So one of the things that strikes me about this whole conversation is the way we make God just to be another normal agent in creation. And, you know, he kind of works the way we work, and he is involved in creation and nature the way, you know, we might be involved as a tinkerer or a designer. And I think we make a really big mistake in doing that. I mean, he is, I mean, the very fabric of creation is dependent on God. It's not that it's out there independent of him, separate from him, and he's not involved in maintaining its very being. You know, that doesn't happen to us as an artisan or an artist or a maker. You know, the stuff of the world is outside of us and has laws and operations that are independent of our work. But I think that's not true of God and God's relationship to creation. Now, you know, we always want to maintain God's, you know, he's independent of creation. He you know, creation is not God. We don't want to go in that direction. But there is this dependence of, you know, not only it having been made, but its very nature and its very being is, in an ongoing sense, dependent on God from moment to moment.
Right.
And I think you know, I think that's kind of what Randy's been getting at to some extent.
Yes.
And so, you know, this talk of you know, God doing things, special things every once in a while to make this and that happen. You know, I really think that's a sort of creaturely way of thinking about the way the world works. If the world is absolutely dependent on God at every moment, at every instant, then its very being and character and is dependent on him in that same moment by moment character. And I don't want to just turn this into total mystery, but I don't think we can actually describe how God does what he does and what he does. we affirm that he's involved as creator, sustainer, provider, governor, and all those attributes. But he is involved in a way that it's sort of incomprehensible to our normal human and scientific ways of thinking about these things.
So, Terry, you would subscribe to the cognitive dissonance view?
I'm not, I usually will say that I don't, there can't be a conflict.
Right. I agree.
That nature is doing what nature does because God is governing nature to do what nature does, and is intimately involved in it in a way that is really beyond our comprehension.
Right. So you're saying the scientific view is complete and accurate, and your theological view of God is what you just said,
mm-hmm.
and there's no point in trying to reconcile those, or you say they're just reconciled by definition, or what are you saying there?
Well, so, it's a what I'm saying about God's role is yes. a faith statement, and
right.
By the way, when Scripture refers to God being in control of the weather
mm-hmm.
and meteorological events, okay, that's certainly not in the realm of mind and
right,
and yet that's
I agree.
The witness of Scripture.
So if I try to add something here, yes, of course, talking about acts of God is a creaturely way of speaking, but we are creatures, and I don't think we can avoid this way of speaking, and it's certainly a biblical way of speaking. So one could add, I'm sure, many other dimensions which are less clearly articulated in the Bible and probably need to be there for a more complete picture of God's relationship with the universe. But as you say, we're not really in a position to go to understand a lot of this. So I'm not worried about talking about acts of God, but you're right in pointing out that there's doubtless a lot more there than we're in a position to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, I think thank you very much for that, Terry. I think you're right on. I think that's a very important perspective. And because we are creatures, but we should not be imposing and describing God as being like us in that sense. He's not creaturely. All right. So I don't see any more hands up, and our time is almost up. So, Peter, I'm really glad to have you on here. Would you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave with us in a minute or two? And
I think I've said all that I can think of right now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That's fine.
Read the article again if you weren't sure of what I said.
Yes, I encourage everyone to read the article and contribute. And all of you are encouraged to write articles in response or letters to the editor. We can continue this discussion in one of many forms. So again, Peter, I want to thank you very much for joining us and for a very stimulating discussion. I want to thank all the rest of you for joining us. We hope to see you on another program. So
my pleasure.
Thank you all very much. Goodbye.